Okay, good morning, everybody. In the seats and virtually, it's great to see everybody. Welcome to our session here on, I forget the name of it, patents. It's our session on patents. We've got some virtual people, we've got some in-person people. If you're watching, we would love to see your face on camera. Just helps with the overall stuff, even though you can't see people in the audience, they can see you, and so they can sort of see who's out there looking at all this. So my name is Geoff Clarke. I'm the host. The way the program works, we're going to start with Muli-san and then move on to Felix. Felix, I don't know how to pronounce your last name. Puga. And then and finally our last paper with Jinlin Wei. So yeah, folks that are here, I taped off the last rows of seats because it's really big room. But otherwise, for Shmuel, for Wallis, because unfortunately his discussant took ill, we're going to do 15 minutes for the paper, 5 minutes for discussion, and 10 minutes for questions. For everyone else, it's going to be 15 minutes for the paper, 10 minutes for discussion, 5 minutes for questions. So, so with that, I think Muli, we'd ask you to take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, I hope you can see it in full screen. Okay, so thank you very much everyone. I'm going to talk about my paper about the effect of labor supply on technological growth. So in this paper, I use the termination of the Bracero program in the end of 64 to get large negative effect and negative shock to the labor supply in the agricultural sector in the US, and I study the technological reaction to this shock. So let me start. So the research question is classic. I ask whether and does labor scarcity increase technological innovation? This question has long history in economic history. For example, the famous Habakkuk hypothesis claims that labor scarcity in the 19th century United States was the main reason for the rapid technological growth compared to other countries, such as the UK. Similar arguments were claimed for many other countries and periods. We can also think about the implications of this question to the debate nowadays about the implication of AI technology, right? So people are afraid that maybe the robot is going to replace us. So if what I'm going to show is true and, labor, let's say the opposite, so labor abundance decrease the rate of or the incentives to develop further labor replacing technologies, so it puts some limits on the growth rates of further AI technologies. Okay, so theoretically the direction of the effect is not clear. We can think about two opposing forces. So the first one, so if scarcity of factor might increase the incentives to develop technologies that are going to replace that factor. But on the other hand, if we think actually about standard growth models, macro growth models, if we decrease the size of this sector, of this industry, so that the number of potential users is lower. So actually, labor scarcity might reduce innovation. So because of that, the overall size of the overall sign of this effect is unclear. But also, it also gives us some guidance about like interesting heterogeneity of this effect, which is we might think that the effect is more positive, the effect of labor scarcity is more positive for technologies that are labor replacing and more negative for technologies that are labor augmenting. So I'm going to touch it in the second part of the paper. Okay, so basically what I do in this paper, I study the termination of the Bracero program in the end of 64. I use variation to the program at the crop level. So there were some crops which hired more larger share of Mexican workers before the end of the program. So therefore they experienced larger negative shock to their labor supply after the end of the program. I'm going to measure, like standard in this literature, I'm going to measure innovation using patents. And what I found is significant, large, and persistent positive effect of labor scarcity or of a negative shock to the labor supply. I also find that the effect is stronger for technologies that are related to labor-intensive tasks. And finally, I'm going to show you that the farm owners or the capital owners were unhappy from this change. So besides the positive technological reaction, they still, the value of the lands will still get worse off. So we got negative effect of the land values. Okay, so let me skip it because I don't think I have time. So so let's start with the historical background and data. Okay, so the Bracero program started in the middle of World War II because of shortage of labor in the US. After the war, in 1948, the Bracero workers were directly hired by US farmers. So this is a period of the program which I study in this paper. In 1951, the Congress approved Public Law 78, which served as the basis for this program until its termination. And what I want to emphasize here is that in the 50s, the program were perceived as somehow like the steady state. So people didn't so much that they're going to end sometime soon. So, I think it's similar to this. We can think about lotteries for visas in the US. So maybe like in 10 years, they're going to be canceled. But I mean, it's not something that we expect now. And when we make decisions, only in the beginning of the 60s, the opposition for the program started to get power, and then in 1962, the government increased the wage requirements for those workers, so the program became much less attractive. And then finally, in the end of 1964, the program was ended officially. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to measure innovation at the level of the crop by patents, and I also use the number of citations to account for the quality of the innovation. I'm going to use it on patents that are related to picking and harvesting a task, because that was the main task of the Bracero workers. And in order to allocate patents to specific crops, I use the text of the patent and I search for the name of the crops in each one of the patents. For example, I look for the name tomato or lettuce within the text of the patent, and I allocate the patents to the crop that mentioned to the crop that was mentioned first. For the treatment, so what I use is a share of, so what I really want to use is a share of Mexicans by crop. Unfortunately, this data is not available at the level of the crop, but so what I use is a share of foreign seasonal workers in the total seasonal employment. This by crop, and this measure is not a better approximation because almost 95% of the foreign workers at this time were Mexicans. So yeah, so that's what I use. And my sample consists of 16 crops, which used more than 4,000 man months of labor in 1964. Okay, so here what I want to first check is whether my measure of innovation makes sense, or whether it really captures the innovation. So the way to see it is to see its correlation with the size of each market. So what I show you here is that there is a strong correlation between the number of patents by crop, according to my measure, and the value of this crop. So the average value of production of this crop over the years of this study. Okay, so now let's go to the main results. So so let me skip it because I don't have a lot of time. So let's go directly to the so that's how the raw data looks like. So I split all the sample into 3 groups based on the exposure to the Bracero program, and what we can see that in crop with low exposure, we can't almost see anything before and after the end of the program in 1964. But with crops with medium and high exposure to the program, we can see even in the raw data, we can see this quick jump exactly 1964 that persists for several years later. to do it more rigorously, what I do is to estimate this differential specification. So so it's a continuous differential. So we account for quark fixed effect and ear fixed effect, and the main parameter of this test is beta, which asks the question: how more patents we have or more innovation we have in corps that were more exposed to the Bracero program in the years after the end of the program. And here are the main results. So we get positive and significant effects. So corps that were hired or that experienced larger negative shock to the labor supply in 64 experienced faster technological growth after the end of the program. So and it is true both for the number of patents and to the number of citations, which is a measure that account for the quality of the innovation. So in order to understand the magnitude of the effect, so an increase in 10 percentage points in the share of Mexican workers during the years of the program impact the number of patents by 32%. So that is, so the elasticity is 3.2. The effect is a bit smaller for the quality adjusted measure, which suggests that maybe there was some junk patents right after the end of the program, but still, even if we account for the quality, we still get positive and significant effect. So here is the dynamic version of this regression. So what we get is that in the years before the end of the program, the effect is fluctuating around zero, but in the years after the end of the program, we see a persistent and positive effect that persists for many years after. Thank you. Yeah, that persists after the end of the program. Okay, so I'm doing bunch of robustness checks, which I don't have time to discuss. Let me discuss two types of robustness checks. So I'm using two types of instruments and synthetic exposure method. So the instruments are pretty standard. I'm using the distance from Mexico and the the historical share of Mexican population to proxy for the exposure to the number of Bracero workers by crop in order to transform from the spatial space to the crop space. So I'm using data from the agricultural census, and I get again a positive and significant effect if something the effect is somewhat larger. Also, I'm using the information from the patents data in order to find crops that are technically similar. So the idea is to find crops that mention more than one patent, and let's say we see many patents that mention both tomatoes and oranges, so we know that those two crops are technically related, exactly in the sense that we are interested in the sense of they're related, that there are some machines that that are able to harvest both of them. And then so we build like a leave one out measure of the predicted exposure to this crop. And first what I show is that they are not correlated. So the actual exposure is not correlated with the technically predicted Fourier share. Second, after controlling for this synthetic Fourier share, we still get the effect is virtually unchanged. Okay, now we add another dimension, which is a technological class. So I don't have a lot of time, but the basic idea is to ask whether, so what I really want to ask is whether the effect is stronger for labor replacing technologies compared to labor augmented technologies. I don't have exact measure of that, but what I can do is to use the labor intensity of each task by crop. And so I got historical data on that, and then I run this triple diff. So yeah, so what I get basically is that the effect is stronger if the task is more labor intense. So yeah, so and if we able to believe that tasks that are more labor saving also tend to be more labor intensive. So yeah, so that suggests that actually we get the right direction of the effect, that the effect is stronger for technologies that are more labor replacing. Now let me go into the final results that we want to show today. I do have time, right? So one more minute?
Yeah, 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So so here I want to ask, so we know that, so we know what happens to technology, so and it is interesting to ask what happened to the farm owners. So we know from historical accounts that they were like against the termination of the program. They enjoyed to have like a cheap labor that came to work in their fields, but it's theoretically possible that they didn't consider all of this technological improvement, and maybe they're somehow better off after the end of the program and this technological reaction that I have showed you. But so in order to check that, what I do is again I'm using the agricultural census. I'm using the land values of each county. So the average land value by acre, and I'm transforming the exposure from the crop level from the crop space to the county space, again using very similar method. Thank you. Yeah. And I'm running this diff, and what I do, I'm doing it separately for Bracero states and non-Bracero states. So there were states with no Bracero at all, and so I run these two regressions separately, and what we get, so for the Bracero states, what we get is that after the end of the program, the land values in more exposed counties were affected negatively. So the farm owners lose from this policy change, even if we account for this positive technological reaction. And as we might expect, we see hardly nothing in non-Bracero states. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Muli. That was excellent. Maybe we can in here we can Great. So like I said, we're going to have a 5-minute discussion, and then we're going to have 10 minutes of questions. I would encourage people to ask questions. As I said, Muli's discussant was unable to attend today because they had fallen ill. So if we could all pick up the slack a little bit, that would be awesome. So let's see. All right. Starting with me, I guess. All right. So Muli, I think, did a great job of summing up his paper. Just to recap, the guest worker program ended all of a sudden with very little forward warning in 1965. And then, there's a variation among how crops used these guest workers. But what Muli found was that labor-saving innovation happens pretty quickly. But even so, farmers, in terms of their land values, end up doing worse overall. Muli does a great job of comparing two different theories, where we think about the simple model with the Cobb-Douglas with the multiplier. Technology would amplify labor output, but there's also this idea of a labor-saving model where technology would substitute for labor. And he found in the Bracero program a very elegant natural experiment. So I want to say that I really enjoyed this paper. I know I'm contractually obligated to say that, but even so, I really did enjoy this paper. I thought it was very well thought out and well organized and presented persuasively. Muli sort of soft pedaled one of his innovations, which was to look at the text of the patents rather than just the classification of the patents. And I think that's a promising idea. I'm not a patent person, so I don't really know how much of an innovation that is, but it sounded like a great innovation to me. And so I only have these sort of minor notes. The first one is probably the most obvious note I could possibly make. As an economic historian, I would, of course, like more historical background in the paper. I think the Bracero program is something that a lot of people don't know a lot about, and people wanting to know about innovation can sort of drive by and get a nice Bracero program overview, because people are just still surprised that there was this guest worker program that ran successfully for 18 to 20 years in the United States. Muli wants to extend his stuff to talking about artificial intelligence, which is a great goal of taking a historical event and trying to apply it to a modern day question that people have. But I think it might need a little more framing to work in that way. I think otherwise it doesn't come up as something that's solidly connected to the rest of the paper. And probably the other thing, again, it wouldn't be a discussion of economic history without asking you to get more data. It would seem to me the first order thing would be to look at the harvest amounts once the program stops. And I think that either way, that would be a good part of the story, because if harvest amounts don't change, then that's a fun way to support your argument. And if harvest amounts do change, that sort of augments your farmers did worse argument. So either way, if you could just briefly mention what happens to harvests after, or what happens to yields after the end of this program, I think that would be a great thing to include in the paper as well. Overall, I think any work that brings the Bracero program into wider circulation, I think is a great idea. And that Muli's work with patents and the patent texts seems novel and promising to me. So those are the discussion comments that I had. And now we can sort of transition to, Muli, you might have a response to that, and then we can transition to questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your comments. Yeah, so of course, unfortunately, I'm not an historian, but yeah, I should definitely say more about the history. That's a good point. About the AI point 8, well, it's like one paragraph in the paper. I think, I mean, like to make this prediction is not. Yeah, of course, I don't say it's the same, and we are in a different area. But still, if you think about AI as maybe very typical labor replacing technology. So yeah, I just say it might have implications also about this like a long run growth of AI technology. But of course, it's not the point of this paper. That's a really good point. It's a good question about the harvest amount. Actually, what I really want to do, and I can't find data, is to find actual number of labor, actual number of workers per crop. But that's unfortunately, at least I didn't find this information. So, that's what we really want to do, right? To find the productivity of a worker. Because the overall amount of the crops, like the harvest amount, is a multiplication of this productivity by the number of workers. And there might be many other stories here, right? Maybe it just decreases the demand for this crop, for example, as a result of the. So I thought, but anyway, that's a very good point. Thank you.
Okay, so I see that Lee Alston has a question. Take it away, Lee.
Okay, thanks. I've been interested in the Bracero program for probably over 30 plus years. And Joe Ferry and I wrote about it. We were interested in the political economy of it, but also in the innovation side as well. So in a nutshell, our take on the program was that they had votes on public law, I can't remember, 50 something, 8 was it? Anyways, 3 years. And as you said, it was kind of a slam dunk that it was going to be passed in the 50s. And in 1960, 50% of the cotton crop was harvested mechanically. And, so I think we use that as a kind of an inflection point. And if you look at the vote on the Bracero program between 62 and 65 and who changed their votes, our argument is really that the South allowed this program to disappear. As you noted, several states in the South didn't use any Braceros, but some used a lot. And I went and talked to the people at the Wilson plantation, which is one of the largest in the country on the Mississippi, but in Arkansas. They went from 10,000 workers to 100 in 1 year for their harvest because they used Braceros. So it was the really large guys who used them. But they were also better able then to, I think, adjust. So it'd be interesting to see the heterogeneity of the adjustment. And also our argument was that, you show, and I'm convinced that there were lots of complementary patents, but the really huge things were, one, not just getting a mechanical harvester, but you had to have biologic genetic changes in the seeds so that the cotton ripened at the same time, so you didn't get it so trashy. Then you had to have new gins with dryers and cleaners because the cotton was wetter when it came out mechanically. And our argument was all that was in place by 64. So you did get lots of subsequent changes, but it would be interesting for you to catalog the changes and the McCloskey sort of oomph from some of these changes versus the other ones. And it was also adopted fastest in the West where it was drier compared to the East. So if you go further east, they adopted the technology later because of the more humid conditions and so on. So I just like to see a bit more of the before and after to be convinced that this was a true shock to them. But I don't think it needs to be. I mean, I think your story still holds. So it's great job. And I'd just be interested in seeing more and seeing more detail on the patents and who they affected in terms of a geographic space. But great job, great work.
Thank you. Yeah, very good points. Yeah, I mean about the political issues. That's, actually, yeah, I'm gonna look after it more. That's very interesting. Actually, maybe it can be of use to use these changes in the political views about the genetic innovation. To the best of my knowledge, actually, it was not patentable until the 80s, I believe. So that's no. If I know, I think you wanted you could not make patents on genetic intervention until very late. So that's it's going to be more difficult to document. But I guess there are other ways to do that. That's really
you're right, but nevertheless, these were huge things that would dampen the resistance of some areas to the end of the Bracero program.
Yeah, thank you.
You can't test them. It should be in the narrative as to the history that the cotton bolls ripened more simultaneously, because it used to be that workers went through the fields sequentially as each week went by.
I see. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, great. So Lee's story, I think, is very interesting because you have cotton, which has this dynamic, but of course it then has spillovers on all these other crops. And so, I was wondering already what happened to the price of fresh fruit for U.S. consumers after the end of the Bracero program. And so now I'm actually really more intrigued about, if you could say something about this cotton innovation driving this Bracero program and then driving something going on in the fruit market, because that's got to be hugely impacted.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's going to be a great extension of this paper. Thank you.
I'm glad we figured out my voice is coming through oddly before I have to actually talk.
We don't have them, right? We don't have the
room. I don't know where they are. Does anyone have a phone number for somebody in the room?
Hi, everybody.
Yeah.
Happy to be back. Sorry about that. We our laptop here on the podium locked up. So maybe if people that are live have questions, we could just ask those super quick. So maybe Muli could answer those later. Going once, going twice. All right. We're going to move on to our second speaker here, who's in person. It's Felix Puga, and comments will be by Walker Hanlon. Take it away, Felix. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for coming despite the time. and for giving me the opportunity to present my work, Competition and Innovation, the Breakup of IG Farben. I'm going to start you off actually in the modern time with some of these really big merger cases that have happened only a few years ago. So the first one here is Dow and DuPont, very well known to Americans, Washington Post titled Jaw-dropping mega deal. The second one between Bayer and Monsanto is a German company buying out an American competitor. And that is particularly relevant because we're going to see Bayer again in just a few minutes. And these kind of things have sparked a debate about innovation in the agri-chemical industry and the chemical industry in general. And that is all part of a broader debate about the strength of antitrust enforcement and rising concentration that is going on within economics and also the broader society. And I think in that context, looking at historical breakups, as I'm going to do in this presentation here, is something that's really interesting and really relevant. So why is that? The first thing is, if you're in an industry that is extremely concentrated and you don't see the necessary innovation dynamics to offset that, then such a breakup might actually be a remedy of last resort. So it might be one of the last few things that you can still do to rectify the situation there. But it's something that we don't actually know a lot about because it doesn't really happen that much. Beyond that, I think it's a very interesting empirical setting because you have a really, really large shock to market structure here. And that allows you to study things that are usually very difficult to get at. And I hope to convince you about that in the course of this presentation. And then it's something that doesn't really happen very often. It's extremely difficult to have these breakups happen, both legally and politically. And so that almost never happens. And for that reason, the only thing that you can really do to learn about them is to go back to history. In the US, the canonical examples are things that you know about. So it's AT&T and Bell and Standard Oil. But I think the breakup of IG Farben, at some point the largest chemical company in the world, is something that should be added to this list of important cases. Very quickly about IG Farben. As I said, at its time, it was the largest chemical firm in the world, the largest firm in Europe. IG Farben itself actually was created in a super big merger between the largest companies in the chemical industry. So there's this parallel to these cases that are going on in the modern world. IG Farben was extremely innovative. They were responsible for some of the major innovations. For example, the first commercial antibiotic in the world for high pressure chemistry. That's the Haber-Bosch process that revolutionized agriculture and is still extremely important to our modern world now. However, other innovations concern synthetic fuel and synthetic rubber, as well as explosives. And for these things, IG Farben was extremely important that there was an extremely big role for the wars in Germany. That at the time, basically without IG Farben's economic activity, the war is not happening the same way that it did happen. At the same time, IG Farben was involved in worst crimes of the war. They were setting up a very big plant at Auschwitz, and a lot of the concentration camp labor was used in that camp. So when the Allies finally are victorious in Europe and occupy Germany, they consider IG Farben as one of the targets that they have to take care of and they have to deal with. And they think it's too powerful to exist. And there's a lot of political economy happening around that process. But in the end, in the early 1950s, finally there's this breakup happening. Part of this political economy implies that this breakup actually largely follows the occupation zones. So the biggest plants of IG Farben are in the 3 Western occupation zones. So that there's some variation here that we can study. In particular, by 1952, the breakup has happened, and the most important breakup outcomes are BASF, which we still know today, Bayer, which I talked about in the introduction, is still around today. Höchst merged with other companies in the 1990s, but until then it was also a global leading company, and there's a number of smaller ones. But these are really the ones that IG Farben is mostly about. Now, how does this relate to a broader literature? There's, of course, the literature on competition and innovation, which thinks about which kind of incentives and disincentives for innovation arise from the level of competition in the market. Theoretically, the effects here are ambiguous, and for mergers, it's in particular problematic because mergers, you don't only have these direct incentives and disincentives, but mergers themselves might create efficiencies. For example, you have a reduction of duplicative research and these kind of things. And so it's difficult to say theoretically what's going to happen here. And so it's just important to go to the empirics. However, that is also problematic because there is this natural endogeneity between competition and economic outcomes. So if you have a lot of innovation going on in a company, the company is going to grow, and that's going to impact competition. And the way that the competition structure is set up is also going to change how companies innovate. In particular, for these discrete events, like merger cases, it's difficult to analyze them because there's nothing that is more endogenous than two companies deciding that they're going to work together in the future. So getting exogenous variation in that context is actually quite difficult. And so for that reason, here having in this case an external actor going in and saying like this is not going to stay the same and we're going to change things is something that I think is very valuable. So that in terms of contribution, I think this is an interesting new empirical setting where we have this shock to the structure across many technological fields. You could even go so far to say that this is a geographically structured breakup that is enforced outside of standard antitrust litigation, so that you have reduced concerns of selection as you would have them in normal merger cases. And so in this presentation, I'm going to talk mostly about innovation, so the aggregate innovation effects, the successes, what happens to propensity to patent, and so to specialization. There's a different component to this paper about competition, market structure, and prices itself, which leads a bit further away. And because there's limited time, I'm going to skip that today, although the data is actually a little bit more exciting. But yeah, only so much time. In terms of data here, this is going to be classical in terms of looking at patents. Here you see an example of one of these German patents. And I OCR them and I extract the relevant information. And so in particular important for us is going to be the technology class written here. And then, of course, information about inventors and applicants, as you have them typically on patents. So one thing that I don't have is patent citations. As you can see in the front page header, there are no such citations, and extracting them from the full text is really difficult. But the OCR of the full text is available. And so measures of patent quality, which are really important in these kind of studies, I'm going to get them from text similarity measures. In particular, I'm going to follow the proposal of Kelly et al. 2021 and look at the similarity of a patent to future patents as a measure of how novel something, how derivative something. The similarity to the future patents is going to define how influential and how impactful a particular content of a patent is, and how similar a patent is to the past is a measure for how derivative it is and how similar it is to past things. And so the quality is going to be given by dividing the future similarity by the similarity to the past. So in terms of empirical strategy, this is going to play out on a technology times year panel. And the left-hand side variable is most of the time going to be quality-weighted patents, the log of that. And then I'm going to define the exposure measure, DI here, in terms of like how much effect the breakup had in this particular technology class, how much did the concentration change. And this is going to be measured by the delta of the Hafendal-Hirschman index, delta EHA. And you can see that, for example, here are two example classes on the right-hand side. In these classes, IG Farben had a roughly similar amount of patents, but you can see that, first of all, by how the shares of the individual companies are structured and how big the sector overall is, the effect of the breakup is going to be different. And we're going to look at how the aggregate sector, the other patenters, and so on, how the tendency of those develops. I'm going to do that within chemistry by selecting a subset of the technology classes in Germany, those that are relevant to the chemical industry according to the description of these classes. It is also trying to hold constant many of the other factors and many of the other things that are going on at that time. Yeah, in terms of the main result, here you see the outcome of this regression with yearly interactions. IG Farben was formed in 1925, and so this is where this all starts here. And then until the beginning of the Second World War, you can see that these trends are relatively parallel. I leave out the Second World War time because, first of all, it's during the wartime, and second of all, institutionally, there's so much going on in that time that it's quite difficult to look at that. Then there's this short period of time after the war where the patent office in Germany had reopened and you could apply for things again, but the breakup had not been executed yet and the structure was not completely clear yet. During that time, you also don't see too much action going on. But then once the breakup has happened, the amount of patenting, the amount of quality-weighted patenting is actually increasing quite a lot in the affected technology classes. Now, in terms of additional results, one thing that you would ask and one thing that you would wonder about is there's more competition going on. Maybe that means that just patents are themselves becoming more valuable. Just before you could coordinate and maybe you don't need to patent everything, but now you do. And so there's this question of, is the propensity to patent changing, basically? And what I do for that is to look at whether the patent quality in these affected classes declines relative to the unaffected classes. And if you look at that, you can actually see that this is happening. So after the breakup, the quality in these classes declines for a short time, but then it goes back to zero. So that overall, the effect doesn't seem to be driven by this quality component, but rather by the overall quantity. Another question is, of course, whether there's an increase in patenting by foreign firms, so whether basically by the breakup of these companies, the German economy became more open to international competition. So that is something that is historically happening at that time, but it doesn't seem to be driving that effect here. Because the entry of foreign companies happens basically immediately after the war ends, and it doesn't seem to be temporarily connected to this breakup. Of course, in this context, you're going to have in your mind a lot of different historical factors, like war destruction, what is happening with the Soviet, with the Eastern Zone, what is happening with dismantlement, and so on. And that's of course something that I need to be very concerned about in the setting. And so I try to collect a lot of control variables here and try to account for many of these things empirically to the extent that this is possible. And the results stay robust to the inclusion of these control variables, as well as calculating these exposure measures differently, so on. Don't know how much time I have to go into that, so I think I'm just going to leave it at that. Okay, wonderful. One thing that I think is really interesting is something about technology specialization. So as I said in the beginning, one thing that people talk about when it comes to mergers is, for example, that, yeah, if you have two companies that are doing the exact same research, it's not going to be very efficient because in the end, only one of them can succeed and the rest of the investment in that research is going to be wasted. So the question is whether this breakup here just led to a duplication of research, and in the end, the benefit to consumers is just the same as if the breakup had not happened. And so I try to look at that by how spread out the technology content of these different classes is. And what I see is that the successor companies are patenting and are working in the same technological space, broadly speaking. But when it comes to the text content of their patents, they are actually specializing. So that this concern of excessive duplication is maybe not as bad as one might think. One very last thing is, of course, we're interested in what's happening to EG Farben themselves. And that's difficult to study statistically because there's just basically three main successors. And so here's a descriptive analysis in terms of how many patents is EG Farben applying in comparison to other maybe comparable companies. So I thought about the electronics industry because that's a high-tech industry that is also dominated by a quite concentrated industry structure, duopoly of IG and Siemens. And these are actually in the German economy at that time the only firms with comparable patenting amounts. Electronics is affected by a lot of things that are happening in Germany at the same time in similar ways, but it's unaffected by breakups. And what you can see is that in terms of just the raw numbers or synthetic controls, that this is that things before the war are quite comparable. And then even in the 1948 to 1952, it's very similar, but the amount of patenting of EG Farben just keeps increasing, whereas these other companies cannot keep track with the same development, and their patenting amount rather remains stable. To conclude, I have tried to talk about the effect and the success of this intervention of the breakup of EG Farben. We saw that it created technological competition in the German economy, that there was an increase of patenting in these affected technologies. And to me, that suggests that indeed this competition here was very good for innovation, historically speaking, and that makes the case of having a strong antitrust regime both at that time and nowadays. And of course, it the question comes up then whether breakups could be interesting as a rare policy tool. I think with only one study, that's impossible to answer, but I hope this is a contribution towards this greater debate. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Felix. I'm just going to take a minute to enable the transcript again. Okay. There we go. Okay. And then change here to speaker view. Okay, I think you're good. Thank you. Good. Hopefully the people online can see the screen. Good. All right. So I have a tough job today because this is one of those papers which is just really nicely done and quite complete, and sort of has all of the natural things that you would want somebody to do in it, and that means that there's not a lot of obvious issues or things for me to talk about. You can probably see that from the presentation, just that it's very sort of organized, and it's a very nice paper. And I am not contractually obliged to say that. It is a very nice paper. So let me just try to add a little bit of value where I can. Right. So to me, the really interesting question here is, how does market structure, specifically the level of competition, affect innovation rates? And I think there's lots of reasons to care about this question, right? We have long-running concerns that market concentration might affect innovation, but theoretically the answer is not obvious, and empirically, right, the existing literature has not really made substantial progress in nailing this issue. And so I think primarily that's because market structure moves very slowly, and we have very few natural experiments to try to understand how changes in market structure might affect innovation outcomes, right? And I think that, that's why this paper is making a really nice and important contribution to this existing literature on this question, which I would say is, has really struggled with this important issue, which from a policy perspective is something that is of very active importance as we think about the possibility of potentially breaking up large firms in innovative sectors. So, right, why is this an open question, right? In standard models of innovation, of course, innovation is driven by profit incentives. Right, profit incentives requires typically, we think, some market power, right? And so these profit incentives are going to be, deeply tied up in the market structure, which of course is related to, the amount of market power that these firms are going to be able to exert, right? And I kind of think of these opposing forces as like there's an escape competition force where there are some models where you have a very competitive industry. The only way to get out of that competition is to escape through an innovation. Right. And, that in those models, right, an innovation, there's strong incentives for innovation because it's the only way to get you out of a very competitive environment. And so the marginal contribution to your profits of that innovation is going to be big. Right. On the other hand, there's this idea of economies of scale that, putting firms together, allowing them to be large, right, can have benefits for innovation that can, through standard economies of scale, type forces, through things like hold-up problems, through things like reducing duplication, right? So it is very much, I think, an open question, and one where, I think there's plenty of empirical work to be done. Right, so, I think the big, on the empirical side, Felix has done a great job assembling data. He's got a really nice experiment. I mean, I think the challenge, if I was stepping back and starting a project like this, I would think, the challenge is going to be, you've got a turbulent environment. You have, sort of a single natural experiment, and, that's going to raise questions about the extent to which, the results are, to some extent a product of that environment. Now,
I think that the paper does a pretty remarkable job of dealing with this issue. That being said, I am not an economic historian of mid-20th century Germany, and so I don't really know if there are bodies buried somewhere that I don't know about, right? To me, it read like something like a how-to manual for dealing with this kind of situation where you have a turbulent environment like this and you're trying to make generate some clean empirical results. But that being said, this is not my territory. Okay, so I have two, potentially useful at best suggestions here. One is, it would be interesting to see more history. And what I mean by that is like, the empirical analysis is convincing, and we see many papers of this variety that have some sort of experiment, they have some empirical analysis, right? And they generate some results, and they do all of the things that applied empirical economists should do. And yet, you think that if this happened and it mattered, that contemporaries would have recognized it in most cases. This seems like a case where maybe the effects were not, perfectly transparent to the people experiencing them, but that there would be, a good amount of understanding of the effects and the kind of things going on by contemporaries, and lots of like corporate records and analysts and investors thinking about these issues. And I just think, that can help enrich the story, which I think is right. I don't think it's going to challenge the story, but it enriches the story to understand, that's happening. And for me, it always kind of, I don't see that, because when I expect a big effect and the empirical results show a big effect, or, maybe not huge, but an important, force going on, you'd think that the contemporaries would be smart enough to recognize it, at least some of them. Okay. So a little bit more history, I think, could enrich the paper. But it's already a very strong paper. The international comparisons thing is one of these terrible comments that I regret having to, even say to some extent, right? Like, if you want to suffer further, here are things that you can do to do so. I do think, as you get to that last graph you showed us where you're comparing to Siemens, like, I think the readers are going to look at that and they're going to think like, why don't we compare to Dow or DuPont or other very large chemical firms in other countries? And I think you say in the paper, right, that it's very hard to do comparisons across countries and these sorts of, with patent systems that differ and things like that. And I recognize that. So this may not be something you want to do, but if I was thinking of ways to try to make the paper stronger, like what's left, that's the thing that came to my mind. I think, the readers will wonder, why does the analysis end in 1965? I assume that's data reason, but I didn't see it, right? I would mention that an additional benefit of your setting is that, patents don't work well in every area of technology, but they work, particularly well in chemicals. And so that eliminates some potential concerns. And you didn't say that, but that's a nice thing that, where things like patent thickets and other stuff like that is, I think, less of a concern in this type of setting. I'm probably about out of time, but I would just say two other things that occurred to me while I was watching the presentations. One is that I think as economists who work with patent data, we should think hard about the dynamics of the response and the time lags involved and whether those are reasonable. I think in this paper, you see sort of reasonable responses, but I think it's worth keeping in mind that, like, when you're changing the incentives for innovation, you're also changing the incentives for patenting existing technologies that can generate, very rapid responses and things that are not new, which may be exactly why you see a fall in the quality. Like, that looked really reasonable to me, but I think, and so I don't think that this is an issue here, but I think it's definitely an issue that we should be thinking about. It's like the timing of the response and whether these are reasonable in these kinds of studies. The other one that I would say, just thinking about, if I have another minute, I guess maybe I do. This text analysis stuff I think is interesting. I mean, I didn't go back and read the papers that are motivating that technique. I do worry that someone actually writes these things. So there are like patent agents and patent agent operations within firms that are generating the text that we see, and that naturally, if I write a paper, multiple times, those papers are going to be very similar, regardless of the topic that they're about or any sort of relationship between the material that's in them, because I wrote them and I write differently than you write. And I think, at the core of this is like, we're using patents in ways that are not, we probably, as economists who work with patents, should think hard about the incentives for the material that ends up in the text of the patents, and whether those incentives are generating, are acting in a way that is going to make a particular measure, like a text similarity measure, make sense. But maybe that's a challenge. I don't think for this paper, but just for us in general. All right, I'll stop there. Thanks. It was a great paper. I really enjoyed it. Right.
Okay, this is our time for questions. If you have a question, come on up. All right, because we want to get you on camera so the online folks can see you. Online folks, if you have a question, please raise your hand so we can call on you. And so here's our first question from inside the session. Let's go ahead.
It's Bryce Fishback. I'm a roadie for Halloween. I just had a quick question. I really like the paper as well. I think Walker gave a good description of what was going on. I do have a question about, IG Farben and a lot of these companies are probably still doing military work and things like that. And sometimes you're not patenting those kind of things. I just wonder if you have a sense of how big of an issue that might be. So, but really.
Thanks, Bryce. Let me have Felix answer that one, and then we'll go on from there.
Yeah, thank you for that question, and thank you for the discussion. The topic of military research and military patents is really an issue, of course, especially because military research immediately after the war was something that both for EG Farben as well as all the other companies in Germany was something that wasn't really possible for a while, and like research was tightly controlled for military applications. So actually that's something I need to look a bit deeper into, like secret patents in Germany. I mean, there's some literature about that for US patents, and I don't exactly know how much this is the case in Germany. They did keep patents secret for sure. So one of the reasons why I leave out the patents that were applied for during the wartime is that almost all of them are basically processed after the breakup. So many of the secret patents might come out then, if they're still useful, and then they might be selectively prosecuted and so on. So that's the main reason for doing that on my side.
These are things that are applicable to Warwick.
Yeah.
That's really what we're interested in.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's a good point. Yeah. In terms of the discussion, thank you so much. Really good points. So the end of 1960 or 1965 was just opportunistic to this point, and I'm working on extending that. It just takes some time. And the thing with the writing of the patents is something that I'm also thinking about. And so I try to look at all the books that are written about EG Farben, but they never really mention the patenting themselves that much. So the historical literature is actually not very helpful. So maybe I need to go back to some of the archives and maybe have a look at that if I want to pounce stronger on the patent content itself. But it's something that I think is really interesting, and maybe I can build something out of that. Yeah. In any case, thank you so much. Look forward.
Okay, we're going to move on to our third paper. Our presenter is Jinlin Wei for 15 minutes, and then comments by Perlman. Take it away, Jinlin.
Yes, thank you, Geoff. Can you see me and hear me clearly?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, good morning, everyone. And I'm really honored and excited to present my paper at the EHA annual meeting. So today, I'm going to talk about financial development and patents in England and Wales during the first industrial revolution. So first, in this paper, I used panel data on banks and patents in England and Wales between 1750 and 1825 to answer the following question. Did the development of country banks stimulate patenting? So country banks were small private banks outside London, and they had at most 6 partners. So I had 2 motivations that led me to this question. So first, previous scholars have documented that banks contributed to industrialization during the first industrial revolution. But we are not clear about whether banks affected innovation or not. We only have anecdotal evidence based on case studies. So in this paper, I use new data to add to the discussion about the finance of innovation during the British Industrial Revolution. So as we mentioned, banks and innovation, both recent and historical evidence from the United States shows that increased banking access could spur innovation, especially in the industries that rely heavily on external finance. So American banks would provide short-term and long-term credit. However, this might not apply to other countries with smaller banks that provided mostly short-term credit. So for example, like in modern developing countries like Uganda or like in England during the first industrial revolution. So in this paper, I construct panel data at the registration district level between 1750 and 1825. So there were about 600 registration districts in England and Wales. Then I used a difference in differences setting with districts and years fixed effect. So using a two-way fixed effect model, I found that increases in banking access are positively correlated with patents per capita. Then the next step, I follow Harwich and True's paper to construct an instrumental variable based on post town status. So post towns were towns that had post offices in them. In late 18th century, country banks tended to locate in towns with post offices for safety, for information, and also to meet demand for financial services from postmen and post offices. Then I use IV strategy to show that the relationship between banks and patents is likely causal. So in the baseline regression, I found that one standard deviation increase in banking access leads to about 6% standard deviation increase in patenting. So country banks mainly contributed to patents in the manufacturing sector that lacked sufficient credit. So my paper would contribute to about 2 strands of literature. The first would be about the role of banks during the Industrial Revolution. So we mentioned earlier that banks contributed to industrialization, but for innovation, we only have some case studies. For example, some country banks in the county of Cornwall acted like venture capitalists. So they lent extensively to copper mines in Cornwall to help them install bottom-watt steam machines, and they made large profits. But there's also contrasting evidence. So in Nottingham, 2 bankers rejected Richard Arkwright when he was trying to borrow some money to build his water frame. And when we look at the geographical distribution of financial institutions and the gravity center of the Industrial Revolution, we might find that they did not overlap that much. So the impacts of banks on innovation might be modest. So in this paper, I provide novel quantitative evidence about how banks affected innovation during the first Industrial Revolution. And also my paper would engage with the literature about the role of banks in innovation. So traditional wisdom believes that banks are conservative, so they might protect incumbent firms, bias against new innovative firms, or avoid R&D investments that are risky. But seems like the 2010s empirical evidence from the United States shows the effects are different across different industries with different characteristics. And the overall effects were kind of positive in both the Great Depression and in the antebellum period. So in this paper, I use a setting, England during the first industrial revolution, when banks preferred to provide short-term credit instead of providing long-term loans. And this paper shows that even short-term credit could contribute to innovation. So now let me briefly introduce the historical background and data. So first, in the late 18th century, there were kind of the major financial institutions in England, included Bank of England, city banks. So there were private banks in the London City and Westminster. And for country banks, as we mentioned earlier, there are small private banks outside London with at most 6 partners. And the partners had to shoulder unlimited responsibilities to their liabilities. And the last are kind of informal financial intermediaries. They are usually local notaries like attorneys, lords, or shopkeepers. So in this period, the country banks could offer overdrafts, advances, or discount bills for the firms to provide short-term credit and mitigate financial sensitivity of firms. But only in rare cases that they would lend to fixed capital investments and invention. They are too risky, and the country banks had an interest cap of 5%. So it was placed by the usury law. And also to measure innovation during the first industrial revolution, I, in the baseline regression, use simple patent counts, but I also take the quality of patents into account. So I use a constructed patent quality index proposed by Nuvolari and Tatari in 2011. They argued that their index is correlated positively with important inventors and inventions between 1740 and 1840, and it covers the period that I examine. So for data, I collect the locations of country banks from 1750 to 1825 from the book of Dawes and Walt Perkins, and also from Benedict Woodcroft's Index of Patents of Inventions. I collected the locations, dates of patents, and occupations of patentees. Then I geolocate them and map them into about 600 registration districts outside London. So to identify the impacts of banks on patents, I use the two-way fixed effect models. The dependent variable here is the natural logarithm of 1 plus the number of patents per million people in district I within 5 years after year T. So T could be 70, 50, 55 until 1820. And the independent variable is the natural logarithm of 1 plus the number of banks per million people in district I in year T. So here XIT prime are time variant controls that might affect patenting. Delta I and delta T are district and year fixed effects. In baseline regression, I cluster by district and also cluster by county and use Conley standard errors in robustness checks. Okay, as the OLS estimation might be subject to endogeneity due to measurement errors and omitted variables, like prosperity could both contribute to banks and to patents. So I construct an instrument. I interacted the dummy of post towns recorded in Britannia in 1675 with the linear year variable. As we mentioned earlier, country banks tended to establish in post towns. So we can see that the bank growth rate was higher in districts with post towns than in districts without post towns. So my instrument would rely on 2 assumptions. Exogeneity. So post towns were not selected based on some pre-existing characteristics, and they might predict different growth trends in patents. And the second is exclusion restriction. So post towns only affected patents through the channel of banks after I take controls into account and not via any other channels. So here in table 2, I report the balance tests of some pre-existing characteristics, and we can see that they're quite balanced between districts with and without post towns, like access to coal field, to seaports, terrain slopes, and agriculture suitability. And this figure should give you an impression about the post-tense and post-roads in 1675. So for empirical results, in table 3, I report the baseline result. Okay, thank you, Geoff. Yes. So in column 1 and 2, I report OLS estimates. So the elasticities between the dependent variable and the independent variable were about 0.044 to 0.049. To standardize, it means one standard deviation increase in banking access lead to about 6% increase in the dependent variable and can be interpreted as 22% increase in patents per capita. And also the effects are about 1/5 of the effects in antebellum America. Yes, in column 3 and 4, I report the IV estimates. The coefficients are about 0.16 to 0.22. The KPF statistics here are about 50, so weak instrument problem is not severe here. Yes, in interest of time, I will just leave the robustness checks to Q&A section. So in late 18th century and early 19th century, the industrial sector was kind of more credit constrained than the agricultural sector, because the returns to industrial investments were higher than consoles and the returns to agricultural investments. So my results shows that the effects of banks on patents were concentrated in industrial patents, and also the effects were larger in districts with higher interest rates. So they are consistent with the theory that country banks lowers the financial costs of industrial enterprises and spurred innovation and patents. I have also extracted qualitative evidence from the bibliographies of patentees and bankers. Yes, and there were several different mechanisms. These are only a list of them, not an exhausting list. Yes. So to test the different effects of banks across different sectors, I first divided jobs into agriculture, manufacturing, traders, other non-trading service sectors, and other occupations using the primary, secondary, tertiary system. So I found that the effects of banks on patents are confined to patentees in the secondary sector. So here in table 5, we can see that in column 2, the coefficient is for the manufacturing sector. It is only slightly smaller than in the baseline regression. That was 0.044 to 49. And we can also see that the coefficient is significantly different from the coefficients in column 1, 3, 4, and 5. And for robustness checks, I alternatively categorize patents into different sectors according to their subjects. And I also found that the effects of banks were larger in districts with coal mines and smaller in districts more suitable for agriculture. Okay, to first conclude, I found that better banking access spurred innovation during the British Industrial Revolution. So comparing the data in 1750 and 1825, I found that increases in banking access could explain about 12% of the increases in patenting. The effects were smaller than the effects in the United States, but not negligible. So the mechanism was that banks lowered the financial costs of industrial enterprises and spurred patents. Even short-term credit could matter and contribute to innovation in England. Okay, so that's all of my presentation. Thank you for listening, and all comments and questions are welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jinlin. Okay. Well, I think I'm not. Let's see.
Oh, sorry, I cannot hear you very clearly.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I bet you can't, because we're dead again. Okay, so hopefully Bitsy will take over like that, and so I'll reboot the laptop again. Wasn't that exciting? All right.
So I think I can hear you in the room if you haven't rebooted yet. But okay, I will just take over and give my comments to not the room. I enjoyed reading this paper and getting a chance to think about these issues of credit access. I feel weird given that I'm like only talking to half the people. This paper asks the basic question: did English country banks create patents? And so it uses the location of country banks opening and the location of patenting to ask this question at the district level. When I read this, I wasn't, because I'm much more familiar with the US than the UK, I wasn't sure when you said district level, whether this is sort of a standard like county in the UK or whether this is something specific to patenting, that these are actually somehow involved in the patent system. The paper excludes London, which I think is very sensible to do since it's very different. And then it instruments these banks by postal towns, which are towns where horses were changed, and the organizational details were established in the 1600s, sort of for military reasons. And it finds in the OLS that one standard deviation in bank opening leads to 6% of a standard deviation increase in patenting, or a 22% increase in the patents per capita. And the IV effects are about 4 times as large, which is a difficult, increase in IV in my estimation. Of course, we all have different feelings about IV, but I'll speak to the instrument a little bit later. So this plays into this literature, which asks, what creates innovations? And so then, because we can't measure innovations very well, we sort of pivot and we say, what creates patents? And the thing is, in this period, we know what creates patents at the most basic form. People. People create patents. And you can see this in a number of papers, but here I put up Mike Andrews' How Do Institutions of Higher Education Affect Local Investment? Evidence from the establishment of the US colleges. So here are towns that got a college or got another institution that drew people to them. And essentially, the towns that got colleges did no better than the towns that got other institutions that drew people to them until, 60, 70 years after the experiment, which meant mid-20th century in this case. So, for the whole 19th century, people came to these towns and they patented, and it didn't really matter who was driving them to these towns. But this doesn't tell us that it's just any people. It's not just any people. No, in particular, what this sort of shows, or what this studies, is people agglomerated around some sort of seed. That is to say, cities, right? It's not just people, it's people in cities. And so in my work, I looked at the influence of the railroad on patenting. And, I find that the railroad increases patenting, but just to make this point at home, it's not just the railroad being there. It's the railroad nucleating people coming. You can see here that having the railroad and that flat blue line does almost nothing unless what happens is that the railroad draws people. So this is like the railroad comes, it brings people in, and then you see patenting take off. But, so we're going sort of through the onion, right? What is it about cities? Is it simply more people in this sort of configuration? Well, no, it's not. In the US context, we know that in antebellum southern cities had many fewer patents per capita than northern ones. And so we saw this at a presentation on Friday that looked at sort of matched pairs of US cities in the slave economy and not in the slave economy. In the northern cities, patented much more than the southern cities did. And so that pulls us back again to this onion, which is okay, so it's people in cities, but what about cities, right? And so, I've done these 3 things. I said transportation, I looked at telegraphs, and I looked at banks. And so I only put this up here because, it's look at this nice thing where he says, look, banks that are in these cities, even though they have these other things that we might think are important, coefficient, right across the bat, that stays really steady. So this is antebellum US. So one possibility is financing, right? The alleviation of credit constraints. And this is clearly important and probably independently important from being in a city, right? So some people in rural areas are going to patent and they're going to have credit constraints, and it's probably independently important to get them financing, but we don't really know how. Like, cities are complicated processes, and pulling out this thread is really, really hard. I put up this aside about the UK versus the US patenting costs, just to point out that credit constraints in the UK are actually probably a much bigger deal than credit constraints in the US. The cost of applying for a patent is many times per capita GDP, yearly per capita GDP in the US or in the UK, and whereas in the US it's actually less than per capita GDP in this period. So like, it's just just the administrative cost. It's really different. And so this brings me to my worry about the instrument, which comes from this difficulty of cities being very complicated processes. We know from Bleakley and Lynn and other things that things that are relevant to the present world can nonetheless sort of catalyze these processes that are important. And so these postal towns are clearly different from other towns because they've encouraged bank formation. But like, why are they different, right? What has 100+ years of having people change horses for the post done that are relevant to patenting? Is there greater literacy? Are there more people? And I think the other paper you cite suggests there are not, which is helpful, but that's not in here. Or is there something else? In the US, having a post office matters for a simple reason, which is you interact with the patent system through the post office. And so just having a post office means that now you can interact with the patent system. And then sort of to specific comment to your paper, I wanted to know what the reduced form of this instrument was, just to get a better sense of what's going on there. So I went and looked at Hellberg and True a little bit. That shows that banks can lead to more growth, which I mentioned. They have this thing that shows that these towns don't necessarily have more people, which I think would be very important for your paper. And then I thought about that, and I was like, look, you can sort of approach banks to growth in the same sort of peeling back the layers fashion that I've sort of thought about patents and people. And you have part of the answer here of why banks create more growth. That is innovation, and particularly in manufacturing. And right, innovation in manufacturing, then you can set up these more productive plants, then you can draw more people to them by having more workers. And so, I actually find that a much more exciting framing of this than I think just like, do banks cause patents? It's like, we know banks cause growth, but what's the mechanism for it? But like any aesthetic choice, right? I'm like, I won't say 100% that this is the right thing to do. I don't know that you can really figure it out until you've tried it, but I might suggest that as a framing. Like, I think that's a fun, interesting framing, which it feels weird to say lean more on the Hellberg and True paper, but I think you actually can lean more on that paper to get sort of a more exciting framing, as well as I put up this figure from their paper, more details on that, right? So they have this impact of finance on these different sectors. And I know that you have some details on what sectors these patents are. And so you can directly test, like, is there more patenting in these sectors that are more impacted by the availability of financing? And then I had some other comments, which I won't bore the audience with having to see too much, just about your functional form and things. So I emailed you those slides to ask the questions. But I really enjoyed getting a chance to sort of think about what are these onion layers of financing. And so thank you for the opportunity to do that.
Thank you, Bitsy. That was great. We appreciate your contribution. Do you want to respond to that? Anything that Bitsy mentioned, Jinlin?
Thank you. Maybe I'll wait more questions, and if we have time, we can, yeah.
So let me ask the audience here. Questions from the audience here? Okay. Let's see if we have questions from the audience on Zoom. last paper and second to last session. Come on, Walker. Yeah, all right, Walker's got a question. Let him come on up here and ask a question.
Yeah, thank you.
I guess when I was watching your presentation, I was just wondering to myself, like, what is that qualitative stuff that you had at the end that you didn't show us? Like, that would have been really interesting to see, because otherwise it's kind of hard to envision banks at this time investing in this kind of, you know, very risky type of activity, as opposed to other sources of financing for these inventors. Yeah. So I just wonder what that looked like.
Yeah, sure. Yes. Let me share. Shall I reshare my screen?
That sounds good. You have the floor.
Yes. I'm not. Okay. I'm sorry. Not very familiar with this setting here. Okay. Is it working now?
Yes, it's working now.
Oh yes, indeed. I only included 3 here. Yes, and there were kind of 4 or 5 I found. So first is direct fundings. So this example was kind of among some people, they are called Quakers. So John Kendrick and Thomas Porthouses, they invented some flag spinning process in 1787, and they were supported by a Quaker banker, yes, called James Backhouse. And so that was kind of story. He supported them in both invention and setting up factories. And that's the story of this financing in Darlington. And also for Thomas Bell, this was a Scottish man who came to Preston to work at Livesey, Hargreaves, Hall and Company. And so we also found that this firm had a bank in Manchester, and also later when these people, Thomas Bell, he also invented a second patent, and this patent also encouraged another patent in Preston. So they were all about printing colors on some textiles. So they had this, and also for Liam Brunn's paper in 2006, he mentioned that the banks promoted Watt-Boulton steam machines. Yes, and yes. And shall I also reply simply, very simple to beat this discussion? Yes, it's just yes, they are very good advice, and I'm really grateful to your discussion. Yes, I'm just do some clarifications. So about registration districts, they are just some kind of level between parishes and counties. So for parishes, there were about 10,000 of them. And for counties, there were about 30 to 40 of them. So I took this map in 1851, and I used the fixed boundary for then across the whole period that I examined. And for the patent costs, I think it's really important that the patent cost in England was quite high. And so and they remained the same for about more than 100 years. So I think patent costs are really high here comparing to normal people, because their annual incomes may be just 30 to 40 pounds. But for Richard Arkwright or someone else, their machines usually took a few £1,000 to even £10,000 to build. So they might not be that important in the process of invention. And last, the post office. So in England, all the patents had to go to London to get their patents. So post offices might only serve as letters, but these people must go to London to get patents. So I also controlled for their traveling costs to London. Okay, and I will look more into what you discuss and advise. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jinlin. We're ending exactly on time. I really appreciate everyone's patience and everyone's contributions. One more round of applause virtually and in person for all these people. Thank you. I wish you all well and health and all that stuff, and hopefully we'll all get to meet in person soon.
Thank you.